Welcome to Chronica. I'm Fred Marrazzo. This show is being taped on Thursday, July 8th, 2004. And with me today, I have historian and author Lawrence DiStasi to talk about his book, Una Storia Segreta, The Secret History of Italian-American Evacuation and Internment During World War II. Lawrence, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming today. The first thing I want to do is talk about, or have you talk about your background a little bit and just how where you're coming from. Because you were started off as a scholar, or what? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, my background is in English and American literature, and when I came to California in the, well, just about 1970, 69 and 70, I started writing, and my Italian background started to come up, and within, I guess, 4 or 5 years, somewhere around 1976, I joined the American Italian Historical Association. Mm-hmm. We're the Western chapter. That's a national organization. And over the space of 3 or 4 or 5 years, I started to hear about this World War II event and an episode that I had never heard of before. So the historian in me and also the novelist in me began to get very, very interested, because it was obviously a great and poignant story. And one of the things that I kept hearing, however, this association met usually in San Francisco, was that people in San Francisco were still traumatized and would not talk about this. Mm-hmm. So I sort of put it on the back burner, kept thinking about it. A friend of mine in Berkeley told me that his grandfather during the war had hidden his radio with a shortwave band under his bed for the duration of the war. And I was again stunned by that. And then by 1992, I believe it was, Stephen Fox's book had come out. It's a book called The Unknown Internment, and treated this subject. So we in the association at that time decided, okay, the story has now come out, at least in part. There's no reason to keep it a secret anymore. Right. And we put together this exhibit, which is also called Una Storia Segreta, which means a secret story and a secret history. And it's secret on both of those levels. It's denied by the government and by historians, and it was also denied by the people who went through it. So our exhibit is called Una Storia Segreta, when Italian Americans were enemy aliens. Mm-hmm. And that exhibit came out in 1994 in San Francisco, and it's been traveling ever since.
Is that right? Where is it currently? Do you know?
It is in New Jersey. It actually just finished a 2-month showing in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, okay. At the Milwaukee County Historical Society there, and is going to Wagner College in Staten Island in October, and to Fitchburg State College in Fitchburg, Massachusetts in November, I'm sorry. And it has traveled now to somewhere over 50 sites throughout the country.
Really?
Yeah.
What about getting this book published? What was that process like? I mean, was it easy finding a publisher for this? I know it's hard finding a publisher for any book, but for a topic of this nature, what was your experience there?
Well, in fact, it happened through an old friend of mine from Berkeley who runs Heyday Books, and also through the good graces of the program in Sacramento called the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program, okay. Which was set up by a grant from Congressman Mike Honda when he was an assemblyman in the state assembly. And Assemblyman Honda set up this program to get the story of the Japanese internment out more, and to implement more different kinds of approaches to that story. And I applied for the grant with Heyday Books, and we got the grant.
Okay.
So that's how the book came about.
So there's a foundation through the California government, the state government.
It's a public education program. I
see.
believe there was $1 million. It was $1 million a year, which was distributed to various people who were doing projects like this. And this was the first one about the Italian-American experience. Because of course that has been relatively unknown over the years.
Right. Well, that's what I want to talk about. I mean, the salient points of your book. I mean, give me a couple of points that people should know about this. I mean, this is something I just started hearing about it, been doing some research, and I was actually kind of stunned. I mean, I had no idea, and I'm an American of Italian heritage myself.
From the East Coast.
Yeah, from the East Coast. That's right.
Well, of course, I'm from the East Coast as well. I'm originally from Connecticut.
I see.
And growing up in Connecticut, as I said, I had never heard of any of this. There's a footnote to that story about my own uncle, who it turns out was affected by these restrictions, but we never knew it. I never heard about it in the family until our exhibit was back in Connecticut, and my sister happened to be talking to my cousin and found out and mentioned it to her, and she said, "Oh yeah, I know, they came and took our radio." So that stunned me, frankly. Right. Your question was about the book. We felt that many of the stories by the people who were affected had never really gotten out into the public domain as much as it should be. And secondly, that there were some very fine articles by scholars and some articles that I personally wanted to write that we needed to get out too. For example, one story that we found out about through our exhibit is what I call fish story, the story about what happened to the fishermen on the West Coast. Right. It actually happened on the East Coast too. The fishermen in Boston were similarly affected. And what I tell in that story is the story of how the government had been planning this since at least 1936. Knew, that is, that it was likely that there was going to be a war with Japan. So they were planning on how they were going to have enough boats to do things like minesweeping. And when the war broke out, as it turned out, the American Navy was inadequate in that regard, and so the Navy requisitioned fishing boats from fishermen in Monterey, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, and those fishermen then were left without their boats, and they were in the middle of a fishing boom at that time.
And without their livelihoods.
And without their livelihoods.
Right.
So many of them had to either charter a boat or go to work on another boat. So that's one story, and the story is interesting because many of those fishermen at the end of the war got their boats back, and they were really ruined, and so they had to spend a great deal of money to get them back into condition to fish. So that was one of the stories. The other story that I think is really important that was never really explored in depth until this book is a story about the internment. Through another scholar, I found out about some records at the National Archives that we had never had access to. When we put our exhibit together, Dr. Rose Scarini, who was the curator of our exhibit, only knew about 8 to 10 men from San Francisco, Italian aliens from San Francisco who had been interned from San Francisco. Right. And she had explored them in depth, gotten FBI records. Well, what I found in the National Archives were records for about 257 exactly, other records of other internees, and found out what had happened to internees from New York and from Cleveland and from all over the country, in fact, because each of those files has what the Army called the basic personnel file, and it shows, among other things, where these internees were shipped to.
I see.
So somebody who was arrested in New York, for example, was picked up in New York, sent to Ellis Island, where he was under the control of the Immigration and Naturalization Service.